Hello, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Welsh. I am the managing editor of The Scene, as well as the stage manager for Dialogues 2019. Thank you so much for joining us for the 2019 edition of EXPO Chicago, the International Exhibition of Contemporary and Modern Art. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Dialogues program presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions, conversations, and provocative artist discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and professionals on current issues that engage them. And a special thank you to our partner, Cultured Magazine. Feel free to grab a copy. With biennial models becoming increasingly ubiquitous, navigating the landscape of large-scale, place-based exhibitions is a growing global curatorial concern. Drawing upon the Prospect.5 Curator's diverse past exhibition experience, join author and sociologist of culture Sarah Thornton, best known for her book 7 Days in the Art World, for a discussion on the values, methodologies, and necessary transparency with Prospect.5 curators Naima J. Keith and Diana Nawi. Please welcome our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you to EXPO Chicago and the Art Institute of Chicago. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Naima J. Keith and Diana Nawi. They are in process of curating or co-artistic directing Prospect.5, the 5th edition of the New Orleans Triennial, which opens about a year from now. What's the exact date?
October 24th, 2020.
Excellent. Put it in your diary. Both curators live in Los Angeles and have passed through UCLA. Naima did her BA in art history at Spelman College and then an MA in contemporary art at UCLA, graduating in 2005, whereas Diana did a BA in art with a double minor in art history and Chicano studies at UCLA, and then went on to an MA in art history at Williams College in Massachusetts, graduating in 2009. Since March, Naima has been Vice President, Education and Public Programs at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, better known as LACMA. And prior to that, she was Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the California African American Museum. And then before that, she was Associate Curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Along the way, she garnered a load of awards and nominations, and we'll probably talk about this later. To her left is Diana Nawi, an independent curator. Currently on view, I believe, she has a show in Shanghai at the Long Museum titled Mark Bradford, Los Angeles. For 5 years, she was associate curator at the Perez Art Museum, Miami, better known as PAM. She was assistant curator on the Abu Dhabi project of the Solomon Guggenheim Foundation. She's been a fellow at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. And she's been a fellow at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in North Adams. I hope I didn't get anything wrong there. Excellent, good. Let's see, I live in San Francisco, and I was like, how long would it take if you were going to do like an environmentalist walking pilgrimage from Chicago to New Orleans? And apparently it's 301 hours. So I'd kind of like to do it if I could find a month in which to free myself. So let's start with a few questions. Now, this is not the first project. New Orleans, Prospect.5 is not the first project that Naima and Diana have worked on together. They actually co-curated a show called Face to Face, Los Angeles Collects Portraiture, but they met each other well before that. And crazily, this photograph commemorates the time of their first encounter. Can you tell us what's going on here and how did you meet?
So when Sarah approached us about doing this conversation, she said, let's shake things up. Let's do things a little bit differently. We, of course, could dive right into talking about Prospect, which I love the fact that you have your Prospect.5 pin on. But we could dive right into talking about Prospect, but a lot
Although
of people
they can't tell us any of the artists they're including yet.
Yeah, we cannot. So the official artist list is not being announced until March of 2020, because we'd like to kind of draw out the reveal. But a lot of people are actually surprised to hear that we've known each other for a very long time. We met when we were babies, as you can see in this picture. We met at a space called LAX Art, which is a nonprofit art space in Los Angeles. I started working there kind of right at its founding when Laurie Furstenberg decided to open the space, and then Diana started soon after. And so we actually met in LA when we were little baby junior curators. So you can see me in the background looking 20 pounds lighter, and then and then Diana with blonde bangs.
Yeah.
So yes, we
was
Diana
cooler
actually
then.
had this picture at the ready, which I was kind of surprised to hear.
I have this issue of V Magazine on my...
So we were in V Magazine. They were kind of highlighting the space, and so this is actually how we first met, working together at LAX Art.
And then when did you work together again, and how did that come about?
We've more or less been in conversation, I think, over the last decade. Just we share a lot of artists. I've written for the Studio Museum. She's written for Pam. So we're kind of in the same familial artistic network, I think. And also, I think we all have like a curator hotline where there's like we pick up the bat phone and we're like, yo, this artist did this thing. What do I do? Or how much should I charge for this? Or have you ever had this? So I think we have always served that kind of partnership kind of function for each other over the years. And then when Naima was deputy director at the California African American Museum, coincidentally, I moved to Los Angeles at the same time as an independent curator, working for Pam and then kind of looking for gigs. And Naima had a crew of great curators, but also a lot of space to fill at the museum. So I did one show collaborating with her and then one show under her at the museum. So it was a kind of nice way to kind of get close again.
I love this expression which you just used, we share artists. Could you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean by we share artists?
I don't know if it's shared necessarily, but I think we're constantly in dialogue. I think because she was in Miami, I was in LA, or I was in New York, and whether she was here, I think we just can't be everywhere all the time. And so what oftentimes happens is that you might text someone, or we're on different juries or different prizes, and so we may say, hey, this is an amazing artist that I came across as part of this jury process. Just wanted you to have them on your radar because I know you're focusing on a show on LA artists. Or, so I think it's just texting each other or, Instagram more often than text, but sharing different, information about different artists because we're, like I said, in different parts of the country and we're kind of finding artists or seeing artists all the time. And so if she knows I'm looking for a particular person or, if I'm just interested in a particular idea, we may share artists that way. So I don't think we've ever worked with the same artists.
We haven't, but I think there's a lot of
But there's a lot of overlap, and I certainly respect the artists that she's worked with. So,
vice versa.
And I've seen, she's seen my shows, I've seen hers. So, but yeah, so we have fairly large, not large, but we have quite a few curators in this network, and we just tend to share information when it's applicable. Yeah.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah.
So, next slide. You've worked together and you have a good perspective on each other. So I'm wondering, Naima, can you tell us what are Diana's strengths as a curator? And is there anything she does better than you?
Yes, a lot. So like I said, Sarah wanted this to be unconventional, so that's why we're kind of like as if we're on a dating show. But I am married and she has a boyfriend, so we're not, together. But
spend an inordinate amount of time
we do
together.
spend a lot of time. And my daughter actually calls her Auntie Diana, and so at this point we are family. But I would say in terms of what Diana does well. So see, So she asked to show or to pick images for each other. And so I chose this image because she did a major Neri Ward exhibition a couple years ago. It traveled. There's a major catalog here. I deeply respected the exhibition. I think it was one of the first retrospectives, survey exhibitions that had been done on Neri's work. I think oftentimes he's included in group shows or he's had kind of seminal works. But I think to see the trajectory of his career over a long period of time, I think was something that Diana did beautifully. She's also, I feel like I'm again talking about my my partner, but she's an amazing writer, and I also think that she, as we're talking about artists for the triennial, I think is very just kind of focused on making sure that the ideas that the artist has for their projects is honored. So not to say I don't, but I think that she's really considerate about talking to the artists, what do they want to do, how can we best kind of support your project, thinking about how the site matches. So I think because we have similar interests in the types of artists, I think it's a great pairing in terms of her, I think, kind of consideration of what the artist wants to do and trying to hold as much to that idea, the original idea, as possible. So she's a great, I would say, co-conspirator with an artist. Or I'm more on, like, I think the museum side. I was like, okay, we can't do this, we can't do that, that kind of thing. So I think somewhere in the middle, I think we find a good kind of middle point. So.
I love that, actually, because I think often people are curious who does what and who brings what to the table with collaborations, and that makes good sense.
Yes. I mean, we talk, I would say, about 3 times a day at least, every day, whether or not it's sharing information about artists or just talking about, okay, who's going to travel to what city, or, or just an idea that's percolating, or, so we're in contact all the time. And,
I mean, they say 2 heads is better than 1, but 2 bodies is really helpful.
Yes, yes. But I also think that Diana's really understanding, because I'm in a much different situation, right? I have 2 kids. I have a very big job at LACMA, and I think that Diana's able to travel because she's an independent curator. She travels a lot more, and so I think that it's been a great partnership in that she's able to be away for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, where I can only go for about 4 or 5 days. So that's also, I think, a good part of this partnership.
So Diana, tell me, what is Naima really great at?
I chose these images because I think similarly, I mean, one of the things that Naima and I have in common that doesn't come up that much because we're so on the ground, but both of our degrees are in art history. And so I think that actually, while we're not, I don't think either of us really refer to ourselves as art historians. That's you. We, I think a big part of our career, especially our earlier career, was really thinking about doing art historical scholarship. And Naima's Charles Gaines show is one of many important shows that she did, but in particular, Charles was well respected in certain circles, but his kind of national presence and the way in which he was contextualized was just missing. And I think he had kind of just wasn't receiving the recognition that he deserved. And Naima's show, it's Charles's work, so it's never not about the artist, but I think Naima's show in a lot of ways put him back on the map and kind of honored his position as an artist and as like a really important teacher in Los Angeles to a whole generation of artists. So I think that scholarship, that like actual curatorial work, and then I put these 2 images of the California African American Museum because Naima, had the same job, her at Studio Museum, me at Perez Art Museum, and Naima is, I think, one of the very first people of our generation of curators to take a leadership role at a museum. And the California African American Museum was a long-standing institution, but it was a state-run museum, and it had a little bit that texture, which is to say, like, the exhibitions didn't change that much. It was sort of kind of not a super lively place. And what Naima managed to do over the course of about 3 years, besides a full rebrand and fully rethinking how they promoted their shows and what their literal street presence was to kind of bring people in, it was to literally bring people in. Every single opening that they had was 2,000 people or more,
Amazing.
Which in LA is unheard of. And it kind of went from this museum that people weren't sure where it is to the most important museum in the city. That was just, it's true, everyone was talking about it. Someone said it was like the cool new transfer student at your school that you didn't know that you wanted to get to know. So that was sort of like what she transformed, and I think, and making it a place for both important artworks, but also a community space. It's an African American focused museum in a city with a really important African American history and population, and I think so much of what Naima brings to the table that I am sort of learning from is the kind of political work of being a leader and of creating space in that way. And so I think a lot of what we're doing in New Orleans is, as Naima said, artist focused, but I think Naima is really always has her eye on the community broadly defined. Who is going to see this? Who needs to see this? Who do we need to talk to responsibly do this? And then I put this picture of Ella, who, it was Ella's 4th birthday yesterday, you guys. And Evan, who's a sweet meatball of a human. And those are Naima's 2 kids. And I put that up both because her kids are so cute and amazing and fun, and it's really nice to like participate in her family life. But also because I think she is, again, in this shift that we're seeing in the curatorial and leadership world, she's a working mom in this really intense way, but her kids are really at the forefront of her public life, and her family and her husband and her mother and her sister and all these things. I think to say that we're people too, but also to say that there are limitations to what we can do. I think women felt and feel an immense pressure to be everywhere, to do more, to do better, and I think Naima has also said there's this other role that we play, and it doesn't undermine my work, but it's a critical part of informing how I think and what I do. And I think as a leader and as a boss to a lot of people now, I think that's an understanding she brings, that we're whole people. And I think that is super a kind of important like feminist perspective to kind of bring to the table.
I mean, if we lived in a properly post-feminist society, we would put our kids on our CVs,
Yes.
and
She's working twice as hard
because
as
there's
me.
so much work.
Yes. I do put them on Instagram quite a bit, and I'm very honest about my life as a mom on Instagram, so including my daughter right there.
And I think it's worth mentioning that Naima's show, Charles Gaines' Grid Work, was nominated for the Best Monographic Museum Show by the International Association of Art Critics. So it's nice to get some international recognition. Let's see. So I asked both our co-artistic directors here to talk a little bit about their favorite biennial experiences. And so Diana pulled out Marrakesh 2016, which had a great title, Not New Now. Tell us why this biennial had such an impact on you.
Naima and I have collectively seen a lot of biennials, and particularly when I was living in Miami, which is an international art hub sometimes, but also is a little bit of an island. I traveled an immense amount, also because I wanted to get out of Miami as much as possible. But I went all over the world when I was in Miami looking at biennials, and I had this immense privilege to go to Reem Fada's Marrakesh biennial called Not New Now. And I have enjoyed many of the biennials I've seen, but why this resonates, I saw it in person, but Naima and I have talked about it a lot, why it resonates particularly with what our task is because it was citywide in the same way. Marrakesh is, of course, this incredible hub in North Africa where you just see all of this cultural collision and, just incredible artisanry everywhere. But I think what was interesting is no offense, artists, but no painting is as beautiful as Marrakesh. If you've ever been to Morocco, it's like there's nothing that can compete with a tile floor, with a tile wall, with a tile. It's just every single aspect of that city is an exquisite sensory overload. And so this kind of idea, how do you make art in that context? How do you put together a show in that context? And how do you compete with or be, I think what Reem did really successfully, in dialogue with that amazing space. So you see, just to say also, it goes without saying, but I'll say it, is that Naima and I are incredibly invested in thinking about an expansive, inclusive, diverse, diasporic art historical canon and exhibitions that underlies everything we do. And so when we talk about shows that are important to us, they also do that. And Reem, at the time, was working also in Abu Dhabi, thinking about the world from that perspective. She's Palestinian, and I think is an incredible expert on Middle Eastern modernism and contemporary art. And so you see these two works, El Natsui and Rashid Qureshi, who are both kind of older artists, but so El Natsui and Rashid kind of
Naima has heard this before, so she can
she
step out.
has.
I'm interested.
There was these two palaces, one that was kind of better kept up and one that was a little bit ruinous. And to see like El Natsui, who I think a lot of us are familiar with the work, he's been in a lot of museums, but to take on the actual architecture, and likewise Rashid or Dineo and Sam Gilliam's work to be installed not against this kind of idea that you need to be in the white cube, but rather to completely put their practices in conversation with that. And also that they took, this is a work by Superflex called Kwasa Kwasa about migration, and to think about also like Marrakesh's role in a broader African diasporic migration and also in a global question of economic migration. So this has been something that we've looked at a lot because New Orleans is likewise, if you've been there, like the most beautiful, interesting, exquisite, lively city in America. And so it's really hard to imagine doing a biennial that you were like, oh, everybody just come in these white cubes over and over again. So I think that is just part of kind of what we've been thinking about. How do you be in dialogue with the city? How do we tell people it's worth it to get on a plane for 5 hours, 20 hours, whatever, and come to a city, and then we're going to just yank you all into a museum that you've already kind of seen all over the world. So it's rather to say, get the map, get a hurricane, hit the street, and see all this kind of work throughout the city. So this was like has been a touchstone for us to kind of think about that.
So we've been given a little hint about what to expect at Prospect.5 now.
Going back to this
Intense dialogue with an amazing, beautiful city, at the very least. I wonder, it intrigues me your choice of these 5 artists. Ellen Atsui and Sam Gilliam are probably fairly familiar to an American audience. Perhaps Rashid Qureshi, Dineo Seshi Pape, and Superflex are a little less familiar. Do you think of that like a balance of familiar and unfamiliar when you're curating?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of what is the privilege of like these kind of citywide triennials is you think you know Sam Gilliam, but you have no idea. You know, it's this kind of thing where you can recontextualize an artist or challenge their practice or put their work in a different light. And I think that's sort of what it's both, you know, and we've talked a lot about what we're not. And we're not a zeitgeist biennial. We're not the Whitney biennial. We're not the Hammer biennial. While there will certainly be the best and the brightest and the newest in our show, that isn't our task. We're not meant to travel the country and cull the best artists working right now. We're meant to put together a thematic group show in dialogue with the city itself. And so I think that is also a really different task, and to ask people to challenge their own practices and to respond to the context as they see it, whether physical, historical, temperate, temporal, musically, etc. I think there's a lot of ways, but I think Reem really did that so beautifully in this show. And it was artists, you know, like Dineo is someone, that was the first time I saw her work. I follow her every move. I'm like a huge fan, you know. And so it's like these moments also of discovery, because I hadn't been to South Africa. I didn't know her work at that time, and now she'll have like 4 shows in the U.S. next year. So it's kind of like you get to both scout and learn, but kind of also kind of relearn what you thought you knew.
But just to piggyback off that, adding a guest to the panel. This is my daughter, Ella. I think what has been so amazing about our trips to New Orleans is that, you know, we go down pretty often, so we're there almost every other month. I'm going down in a couple weeks, and then we're both going to be there in November. But because it is such a dynamic and historical city, we realize, just like you were saying about Marrakesh, where you can't compete with it, right? So it's the idea that you're inviting artists to do something in an incredibly rich context. But we also learned there's so many artists who have never shown in New Orleans. And so what we found is that, or even, you know, different cities in the South. So the idea of being able to like come to New Orleans, to spend time there, to make a, you know, really dynamic project has been exciting for a lot of artists because they have not had the invitation or the opportunity to really think about what it means to make something in an incredibly rich, historically rich, and culturally rich city as well.
I'm sure it must be a great relief not to be burdened with the task of doing a zeitgeist biennial. I mean, I feel like that is kind of impossible, and you always have to narrow it down somehow.
But Naima's done, I mean, at the Studio Museum, she's done that. She has that under her belt. She did one of the F series show at the Studio Museum, which is very much you go around the country and it's like what's important and kind of unseen right now. So I think I have not had the privileged burden of doing that, but I think it is such a different task.
But I also think that that's kind of the expectation of the triennial, right? Even though that's not the mandate, even though it's not the mandate, it is kind of the assumption that artists are going to be responding to this time period, right? So even though we're not asked with finding the newest and youngest and all that, and even that I think is kind of problematic because it's kind of like unknown to whom, you know, so it might be known to, you know, but that's a whole other. I do think in a lot of ways that that artists are, I don't want to say expected, but the assumption is that they're making a commentary on our time. So it's different in a lot of, obviously, than the Whitney and other things, but I think the expectation of it being a commentary on the now, I think, is similar in that way. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting.
Next slide. So Naima felt inspired by many biennials, including a particular edition of the Whitney, but we're having her talk about Prospect.1.
So I've had I've had the pleasure of going to every Prospect because I deeply believed in the mission of the organization and its goals, I think, from the very beginning. And I remember not only just hearing about Mark Bradford's Arc, because I'm from LA and I obviously knew he was building it, but also I think to see it in person and to go down to the Lower Nine and to experience, I think, not just the piece itself, but also the community engagement aspect of the work, I think was really moving. And I think that, and as well seeing Neri's installation at a church, which is very close to Mark Bradford's. I think, yes, honey. Okay. So, also seeing it, I think, or seeing both of these, I think really challenged me to kind of think about what it means to make something in a site, right? And how something could be both responsive and timely, but also quite moving and also quite political, right? And the idea that this arc, I think, said so much, at a time right after the storm and at a time where people were still very much discussing the, huge impact that Katrina had on the city. I just remember thinking just how moving and timely and political this piece was. So I obviously I hope that we are able to create the same thing, but also just thinking about the power of triennials and biennials to respond to a place or to maybe illuminate a conversation that needs to be had in a particular city.
Awesome. So I asked Naima and Diana what were the most common mistakes made by artistic directors of biennials, and they quite rightly turned it on its head in the spirit of positive politics and diplomacy to talk about successful strategies. And so we have 4, and I think they're all very interesting. I don't know who wants to take this one. Diana? Site specificity and local engagement.
It's just to say, I think the Carnegie International comes out of the Carnegie, which is a physical museum in Pittsburgh, and it's the oldest. I think it's every 5 years now, but it's the oldest ongoing international exhibition in the United States. Started around the same time as the Venice Biennial, part of that kind of modernist global moment. But this project was in the 2013 Carnegie International, which was Dan Byers, Sina Kukielski, and Daniel Birnbaum. And it was a kind of light touch biennial that a lot of what we saw as visitors were objects in the museum, but what we knew that we were missing was all these things that had happened just for people that lived there. And that's such a critical thing, right? This prospect, we know, 1,000 people will come on opening weekend from all of us metaphorical foreigners from all over the country and the world, et cetera. But that biennial is up for over 3 months in a city that has its own permanent population. And that's actually your most important audience. And we are very cognizant of that. And I think the Carnegie did a really beautiful job of not only creating work for that audience, but also in engaging that audience. So this is Andrew Carnegie is a wealthy industrialist, and among the many things he did while endowing a museum was also to create these libraries all over the city. So he's someone who really brought the concept of a lending library to life. And so this library is in Braddock, which is a area kind of, I don't know if it's properly in Pittsburgh or just outside Pittsburgh, that these women at Transformasium, which is this kind of queer collective that took over this kind of old gym, created, which was an arts lending library. So what you see are literally works of art that people can go through and check out. So local, like deeply local humans, like normal people, can go to the library as they would to check out a book and check out works of art. And so they contributed works, the Carnegie lent works of art, and it grew over the course of the biennial because people were like, this is really amazing, and I want to see little Timmy have this print above his bed for 2 months to live with it and to be like, what does it mean to live with art, and what is the privilege that so many of us don't have because we're not part of a collector class to make art accessible. And when we talk about all these museum values of accessibility, this was like such a radical way of making that real. I thought it was so beautiful, but it's something that touched the lives and the day-to-day of people that actually live there. And I think that is something we talk and think about a lot.
Next successful strategy.
Maps.
And this is an example pulled from Desert X this year. Choreographing visitors.
So one of the things, so actually Ella and I and her little brother went to Desert X a couple months ago. And I think why we said it in terms of successful strategies, I think it was just really helping people navigate the sites. Oftentimes people are just kind of given this very kind of rough map and they're kind of expected to like kind of find all these very maybe hidden gems. And often for the kind of a normal person, it's really, even for many of art goers, it's very difficult for us to navigate and find some of these spaces. And so I really appreciate the fact that Desert X made their biennial so accessible by simply having a really well organized map. I know it sounds very like I know it sounds very kind of like matter of
It's the
fact.
classic problem of a biennial. I mean, how many
Yes.
people have been to Venice and never found a certain pavilion because they just got tired of walking in circles?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think the scavenger hunt is part of it, but it's like, it's great if you actually know you're going to end up at the place. You know, I think
Eventually.
that's part of it.
With
yeah.
at least cold drinking water when you arrive.
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean,
and they
just
did
the
a
idea-
beautiful job.
Just the idea that thinking through, what does it mean, about accessibility, and just making it easy for people to find something, and not, yes, I mean, there's a bit of it, there's a treasure hunt, but there's also like we want everyone to feel a part of this, process and a part of this, biennial by making it easy to find something. And I think we're certainly working to do that for ours. But we just are kind of surprised sometimes about how difficult it is sometimes to navigate some of these spaces. And we're thinking to ourselves, like, if it's difficult for me to find it, like, what would how would the, I don't want to say average person, but just, the kind of the passerby kind of realize or know where to find something, what they're looking at, I think, so we just really appreciated the fact that, that Desert X made it so easy, and we saw so many different types of people there. So it was a testament to the fact that it actually worked. So I know it sounds very like,
Well, and interestingly, one can be taken aback by the degree to which younger people do not know how to navigate real space without an app or Google Maps.
We're going to have printed maps and digital maps.
That way, so that's for the older generation.
Wherever you guys are in your life. I'll come hold your hand. We'll go see stuff.
All
Whatever.
ages biennial. I look forward. And tell us about this then. This is the Sharjah Biennial, curated by Unji Ju. And, successful strategy, a coherent vibe, an experiential.
I mean, I think what I always joke is that a biennial is just a vibe, right? Because when you go see an exhibition in a museum, you kind of walk in the door, you cross the threshold, you're kind of trapped in this space with this work. You can kind of see things, what's being communicated to you is literally on a label. There's a kind of, you're always in the context of the museum. It's a very closed context. And you can come away, often I do, with, that was my favorite work, and that was really a strange juxtaposition, or whatever your kind of thing, but you're really engaging with one-on-one art objects, often in a museum. And a biennial is totally the opposite, if it's outside of the institutional walls, which ours is. So this idea that you're going to see probably 75 works of art over the course of 2 or 3 days, or if you live there at maximum over the course of 2 months, which is still an inordinate amount of artwork to see in a short period of time, and that every time you walk out of a building, you're back in the city. And so we can't control that context for you. So it's how do you integrate the city into your own thinking? So rather than have it be a disruptive kind of factor, it's something that you learn to think of. That's really the benefit of the show, that New Orleans is also a character in this play. And Unji's biennial in particular, I thought about the way she handled time, the dimension of time and space, so this project by Adrián Villarrojas was out across the desert in Sharjah. And they provided cars and buses where you could go from the city of Sharjah out across this 45-minute drive across like really empty desert. I saw my first camel in situ. It was totally profound. I was like, oh my God, a camel in the desert. It's so real. But then you kind of have that like 45-minute drive to think about landscape, to think about heat, to think about dryness. And then you get into this abandoned warehouse where his project has this kind of idea. And so I couldn't help think about the geologic time that he was suggesting, right? Because I'd had this profound experience with the landscape. And so I think those ideas of time and how we move through space, that's our responsibility to kind of create that for people. And I think a biennial always has its own tempo, its own schema, its own rhythm. And that is something I think we're trying to be really serious about choreographing and thinking about, even with all of the millions of unknowns that attend the kind of urban landscape.
I certainly believe very much in the power of mood to pull together works into a sum that exceeds its parts.
Yeah, and
it's not just about dry ideas or kind of abstract themes. There's often a strong feeling associated with a biennial.
Yeah, It's a very effective experience, I think.
Successful strategy number 4, spectacular and ambitious works. And the example here is Made in LA, the biennial at the Hammer.
So I think Diana and I both saw the show a number of times. Okay, we both saw this show a number of times. I think what we really liked about it is that one, I think it pushed a lot of the artists that we've known very well to do new and ambitious projects. So like E.J. Hill, for example, was in this kind of installation that he so the photographs, and he was standing on this pedestal. The installation was really about his experiences attending many of the high schools in Los Angeles. And but he stood on top of that pedestal every single day during the museum's opening hours a day on that pedestal, and did not move. And did not change his facial expression or didn't greet a visitor, literally just stood there for people to kind of look at him, stare at him, contemplate the whole thing every single day. And so this was something quite ambitious for EJ. I mean, he had done a project similar to that at the Studio Museum in Harlem about 2 years ago. But in terms of standing atop this pedestal for that many hours a day was something fairly new. And so it was just the idea that the Hammer Biennial really did kind of encourage artists to take that leap, to do something new, to do something, I would say out of the box, as well as that the work was a commentary on politics, but it didn't feel like it was hitting you over the head. Like we felt like it was a very timely biennial, but that it wasn't necessarily directly about our political climate necessarily, or there wasn't necessarily any overt. I think there was very kind of subtle and more nuanced messages about our political time. So I think we really appreciated the fact that we really did see all artists bring their A game and do projects that were quite ambitious.
No.
Next question. What can Prospect do that other biennials can't or don't do? And here we have the example of a particularly famous work commissioned for Prospect.5, Andrea Fraser's Not Just a Few of Us. And actually, thinking about it, Prospect does have a reputation for being one of the more political biennials. In a more consistent way, let's say, than the Whitney or the Carnegie International. What can the Prospect do that other biennials aren't doing?
I think to piggyback on Naima's earlier discussion of Prospect.1 with Neri's work and Mark Bradford's work, which are now pretty much icons of contemporary art, that's what Prospect can do. Prospect can be incredibly ambitious. Prospect can take you somewhere you haven't been. Prospect can, as Naima indicated, while we're not talent scouts, the zeitgeist is about what the works are capturing about this moment. And when we think about Mark Bradford's Arc, which I just reinstalled in the Long Museum in China, which is the first time it's ever been shown in its entirety since Prospect.1, when you see this massive life raft in this idea that it was positioned in New Orleans, just a couple years after Katrina, when the city was still really on its knees, and to see it again in China, it feels so timely and so resonant. And this idea that you can really be of our moment in a way that is abstract and poetic, but that is a punch to the gut, I think is really beautiful. And I think Andrea Fraser's piece, it was fantastic on all these kind of fundamental levels. Like, she's amazing. It was an amazing performance. It was just incredible to see, the way that...
Can you just tell the audience what she did?
So Andrea Fraser is a many media artist, and for Prospect, in the auditorium of the New Orleans Museum of Art, where I was to the rafters, we were on the floor, we were in just packed auditorium. She walked in, she stood at the lectern in a very basic auditorium, and she recited verbatim the transcript of the city council hearings around integrating the Mardi Gras cruise, which happened, I think, in the 80s. Much more recently than you would like to have thought it happened, but it was this incredibly... she took on the voice of all of these people, from the kind of old woman who was well, we should do this, to these kind of white supremacist politicians, to these kind of conservative people, to these kind of everyday people. Every voice in that hearing. And it was this kind of amazing way that she took this moment in New Orleans history, which I think one of the more remarkable things about this, I think David Duke who was the Grand Wizard of the KKK, who went on to run for president, was also like sitting on the city council or somehow, an active politician and political member of New Orleans scene, just to give you a sense of what that moment was like in that city. And what she was able to do was animate that and bring that totally to life for us in the most incredibly engaging way. Everyone was just on the edge of their seats to effectively hear a transcript from a city council meeting, which if you told me that was what you were doing, I'd shoot myself before I went in. But it was like this thing where we knew that she could kind of bring that. And I think that is something that Naima and I are thinking a lot about, is New Orleans is a city where its history both, at this point, Katrina is actually contemporary history, right? It's 15 years ago, which is an incredible, in this incredibly sped up time that we live in. It's now we're a generation removed from it, and it's shaping our present moment in this kind of reaching out from the past, actually. And I think Andrea's performance and what Prospect can do is to pull all of that history forward in a city that is so saturated in history, but that, is so, that's a future city in the same way. Like when New Orleans, all these questions of race and politics and climate justice and all those things, New Orleans is ground zero for so many of those things that are shaping the entire American landscape. And so I think what Prospect can do is think of New Orleans as the American city, but also as an American city. And that's, I think, what the privilege of working in that city is.
Sounds great. I am skipping that question in the interest of time because I want to open up. This is my last question. Then I'm going to ask Ella a question. Then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So, we all understand that the canon does not have enough artists of color and women in it. But more specifically, how do you see the canon right now, and how might you like to expand it or disrupt it or challenge it?
So when you asked us this question, we were thinking about examples of shows that either we've worked on or shows that we've seen that we feel like expand the canon quite well. And I brought up the example of Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, which was curated by Kelly Jones for the Hammer Museum in 2011. And I had the privilege of working with Kelly on this show very closely. And I think what that show did, so it was a part of Pacific Standard Time, which is a Getty-wide or Getty initiative, in which they basically fund exhibitions to happen all over the city. And this was their first PST. And so I felt like, what this show did is not only demonstrate, I guess, the immense contributions that African American artists have made to Los Angeles and has made to Los Angeles art history, but also I think challenged people's understanding of how artists lived and worked together during that time, oftentimes across race. So a lot of people didn't realize that this artist was married to this artist, or these artists actually worked together, or so it was, I think for the first time, or people didn't realize that that David Hammons had spent a number of years in Los Angeles. I think people only really see him as a New York artist, and we were like, no, he had a substantial career in LA before moving to New York, and so I think this show did an amazing job, I think, of expanding the dialogue and for people to see that Los Angeles has been, I don't want to say at the forefront, but it's certainly, at leading the dialogue, I think, around art history and around ways of working for a long time. So it's not LA is not just new to this scene, but like I said, has been actively contributing to a larger art history for quite some time.
Diana, do you want to comment on the John Dunkley show?
Coming back to this question of art history, because I think in some ways the ethical answer is like to destroy the canon, right? Like it's enough. It's been enough. Like we know it or we don't, and it's kind of become this really predominant and sort of oppressive mechanism, I think, that we work under and against. But I also think as art historians, there's a certain way that we also know that that's what we're all up against, and that's where our work, where a lot of our work happens, and a lot of the work that we're doing for the future happens. And so, John Dunkley was an exhibition that I did at Perez Art Museum with Nicole Smythe Johnson, who's a Jamaican art historian and cultural producer, around this artist John Dunkley, who's incredibly well known in Jamaica. He's patrimony there, a very important self-taught artist. but he was totally unknown outside of Jamaica. And it's this sort of thing where, so then when we talk about Jamaica, we have all these kind of images of the 1960s and these kind of cliches and whatever about the country, but it's like, well, there were people like during the national formation period of the 30s, 40s, et cetera, there were people making amazing work. And we need to talk about that, and that needs to like see the light and get conserved and enter into museums for perpetuity, and to like narrate these stories with as much care and diligence as we might a story of somebody else who's already had like a kind of the privilege of that act of kind of honoring and restoration. And so I think what John Dunkley was just kind of this remarkable example, because like I feel confident that no one will ever teach a Caribbean art history class without mentioning John Dunkley, because it would become at this point an oversight. So for Nicole and I to work and to piggyback on the amazing scholarship of Jamaican art historians to bring that out into a global conversation, I think was really important. And I think that's a lot of the work that we're doing, is to suggest not only who should be in the canon, but to talk about how that canon needs to expand as a context as well.
Ella, have you got shy all of a sudden? No. So I get the impression that you go to a lot of art exhibitions and meet a lot of artists with your mom. Do you have a favorite artist?
My
Maybe your mom can remind you. Yeah, I was thinking.
Who do you want to say? Do you want to say Charles Gaines?
I want to say
Can you give her the mic?
thank you. Thank you.
That is a good thing to say when you got the mic, right? It's probably the most common thing people say when they've got the mic. I think she's been to a lot of museum dinners. Maybe she's even watched Andrea Fraser's official welcome. Well, if you have any questions, you can join in with the group, but you have to wait your turn. Do we have any questions for Naima or Diana? Right here, please.
Hi, how are you doing?
Girl, hey.
I know you can't reveal much about the artists, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the specific sites you might be engaging with in New Orleans and how you're going to use them. Yeah.
Yeah, we are probably going to be in around 20 sites, and Prospect has the great track record and great privilege of partnering with formal institutions there. So CAC New Orleans, do I see you in the audience? New director. And NOMA and the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, which is like this totally amazing museum. And we'll be at the African American Museum. We'll be at the Amistad, which is a research center. We'll be at the Jazz Museum. So we'll do all those kind of formal partnerships, thinking about those sites. And then every artist that comes to town is like, get me a church, get me a open field, get me a boat. I want to be on the river. I want to be next to the river. I want to be in a restaurant. I want to be in a bar. I want to be in a parking lot. So we have directed people like, maybe you should think about this, or we're talking about this. Have you been out here? But I mean, every artist, like we're like, don't you just want to be on a white wall somewhere? And they're like, no, I want to be out. I want to be in the public sphere. I mean, I think Prospect has this reputation now for people that it can totally open up and challenge their practice to be in untraditional spaces. So it's been really exciting to see people. One of the first things we do with every artist when they come there is a subjective driving tour, which is whatever local wonderful New Orleanian we can get to pick the artist up and drive them from L9 to Uptown, which is effectively to cross the city, and just point to things. And then when the person gets out of the car, you'd be like amazed, like, I want to go back to that building that we saw in the middle near that, and it's like people's imagination is totally running wild, like in the context of the city itself.
But I would say that the museums have been longtime partners of Prospect, so we've pretty much they've always, I think, participated in every triennial. But I think being in unconventional sites, while fun and exciting, this is now using our personalities, while fun and exciting is also very challenging, right? Because the real life of electricity and climate control and security and safety and like all those kinds of things. And obviously we want the piece to be up for the whole 3 months without, so much damage. So I think, just thinking through with artists that, yes, we want them to be ambitious, and yes, we want them to dream the big dream, but it's also kind of the reality of us thinking through what that means, both for the work itself, but then also the responsibility of Prospect to maintain that work. So I think that's also one of the kind of challenges of being in a a citywide triennial is that you have to think through all those different things when you're thinking about these various sites.
Is there a lot of competition for churches? I would think that was a...
Well, so it's less about competition. Hold on, okay. So it's less about competition for churches and more about okay. So for example, if it's I don't say abandoned, but if it's an abandoned church, it could be an event site So the idea that there could be a wedding there on Saturday and something else there on Tuesday, and so thinking through what it means to have an art piece in that space when there could be something totally different happening there every single week. But yes, churches are hot venues actually for.
It's a very Catholic and very Christian city.
We have another question right here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about your relationship, about your work, and your curatorial philosophies. I was wondering, I lived in New Orleans for a long time. I did research there and independent curating, and I worked at some museums and so forth. And one of the things that I heard a lot from artists of color, particularly Black artists, working in New Orleans, was that they felt as though Prospect was not responsive to local artists. I have seen a little bit of the expansion and contraction of the satellite program, and I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the satellite program and how to kind of strengthen that infrastructure, but also just more generally, like how you're approaching working with local artists within the context of this being an international group exhibition throughout the city.
I think we can talk about a couple different strategies. I think the satellite program is a series of exhibitions that organizations that already exist in New Orleans put on, and that Prospect effectively generates a descriptive list about and hands them to people alongside the biennial map. And so this year we are scaling down the satellite program in order to actually give funds to people so that we put out an open call to the entire city to say, send us a proposal for an exhibition that takes on the theme of history, however you want to conceive of that. And then Naima and I will work with a couple of local advisors to select 10 to 15 exhibitions. We'll give money to them to put that on, and then there'll be satellite projects. Because what we found was when it was 100 galleries, if I was coming from out of town, I had no idea what to do. So in kind of reducing it, we're going to reduce the stamp of the satellite project to give resources to it, and then also create a list of galleries all over the city. That's a total open call. And which is one way to support local artists, is just to say, there's already things going on here. We're just trying to shine a light and get feet in the door. Another thing, there will be a number of local artists included. It goes without saying, but we'll say it. But then also we are working with local authors, photographers, poets to contribute to the catalog. And then we're also doing a public programming initiative that instead of hiring one person to do kind of like museum kind of style didactic programming, we're asking people that live there and other places to come in and work with local organizations to do all of the public programming. So it's not just artists, capital A, but it's also cultural producers, writers, people who run organizations, all kinds of things to try and get that buy-in, not just in this idea that we're only supporting you if you're in the biennial, but to say there's a whole infrastructure and a whole universe that the biennial hopefully can create to support people and to literally give them money, right? That's probably the most important thing. It's pay people and support. Being an artist is super hard, so to do that, but
Yeah.
also to shine a light.
Yeah, but I think besides all the things that Diana just mentioned, thank you, honey. Besides the things that Diana just mentioned, I think that's one of the kind of really major conversations that we had at the very beginning, right? Because I think all the prospects have had kind of a smaller. Maybe about 10% of the triennial or the biennial originally was of local artists. It was always kind of conceived as being an opportunity for international artists to come to the city to create work in response in New Orleans. And so that's, I think, always been the kind of dilemma of Prospect, because I think obviously people realize the immense amount of attention that the triennial gets and the opportunities that it could bring to local artists. But it was always conceived of an opportunity for international artists to come to the city. So I think that's one of our first major conversations on how to reconcile that. So I'm not to say that any of these efforts resolve that at all, but I think it has been kind of an ongoing challenge for Prospect to figure out what role it plays in supporting local artists in comparison to NOMA, for example, or that the museums are actually there full time, right? So how do we kind of balance what the responsibilities of Prospect are with what the responsibilities of the New Orleans Museum of Art or the Historical New Orleans Collection or CAC or that type of thing to amplify what artists of color are doing in the city? So I think it's been an interesting.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
It's a challenge.
Every
Yeah, so I just want to
biennial.
acknowledge as a challenge,
We're
and that
trying.
we're trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
But also this acknowledgement that Prospect can't do everything, right? So it's one of those so I'm not trying to not address the question at all, but just to acknowledge that it's a conversation that we've had many times, and I think previous artistic directors have had, just about how to celebrate what's happening locally, but also honor the kind of original mission of the institution or the organization.
So we have an urgent question, and it will be our last. Ella, fire away.
Mommy, will you say something for me?
Okay. Okay.
You can thank the group if you like.
Yes, thank you.
Would you like to thank everyone for coming?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much
Thank you guys for being so
coming.
patient.
I hope we'll all reunite in New Orleans
Yes.
in a year's time.
Yes, October 2020.
Be there or be square.
Thank you guys.